Good evening, bonjour, dear colleagues and friends of the Ritchie Institute and of the University of St. Joseph in Macau. I'm very glad to open this public forum as we continue to explore the notion of spiritual transformation. We had already explored transformation looking at a new economic paradigm. We also were looking at transformation in the theology of Gregory of Nyssa. And today we are really very glad that we have Professor Yves Vendé among us, who joins us from Lille in France. From the Ritchie Institute, we have already been profoundly enriched by the research of Professor Yves Vendé, who is member of the Macau Ritchie Institute since 3 years. After learning Mandarin at the University of Business and Economics in Beijing, Professor Vendé taught French and Latin for 2 years at the Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou. In 2014, he joined the PhD program of Sun Yat-sen under the direction of Professor Chen Xiaoming and finished his dissertation in 2018 with a PhD with the title From Comparison to Dialogue, Research on Zhu Xi's method of reading from the point of view of intercultural philosophy. After a postdoc at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, he's now teaching philosophy at the Catholic University of Lille. Professor Vendé will partly refer on his PhD on Pierre Hadot, which is going to be published in number 9 of the Macau Ritchie Institute journal. So without further ado, I will give over to you, Professor Vendé. Thanks very much indeed for giving us and continue to give us your strong support. Welcome. Bienvenue.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to share my research and my reflection tonight. I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to share the screen with the title of the article. So you have already introduced me, Stefan. If some people want to know more about the way of doing Chinese philosophy and how I was shaped and my own way of doing philosophy was shaped by my PhD director, you can follow this link. It's an interview of Chen Xiaoming, and it explains how Chen Xiaoming conceived a way of doing Chinese philosophy with the Chinese classics. So for today's presentation, I am not going, so the paper itself, the one who is going to be published in the Macau Ritchie journal, is very much, it's a shorter version of what I'm going to do today. So today I'm going to speak on the paper, and I'm going to give a broader view on this issue of spiritual transformation and how several philosophers in the 80s and in the 90s in France, but also in the US, have been reflecting on the meaning of spiritual transformation, especially in ancient Greek philosophy, and how we can use that to engage a dialogue with Chinese tradition, and especially Neo-Confucianism. So my first part will be on philosophy as a transformation of the self, and I will describe how Pierre Hadot, and not only Pierre Hadot, but also philosophers like Foucault or Martin Nussbaum, understand transformation in a philosophical perspective, with the perspective of philosophy. I will then move to applying this perspective on Chinese tradition, and I will especially show how, in fact, you already have a number of Chinese scholars who are using Pierre Hadot's philosophy and research to describe their own tradition, or scholars who are doing research on Chinese classics who are also using Hadot understanding of philosophy to describe the Chinese classics. And then in a final and last part, I will move more precisely on Zhu Xi and how, especially for what regards the relation to classics and reading classics, but in fact we could say the same with performing rituals. But of course I don't have, I mean, in the scope and in the frame of this paper and this presentation, I cannot develop everything. But at least I will say a few words on how for Zhu Xi, the Neo-Confucian self-cultivation method can be understood or may connect with one way of understanding spiritual transformation in Greek philosophy. So that's the plan for tonight. So let's start with a Pierre Hadot perspective. So in fact, Pierre Hadot was a French historian. He was an historian of philosophy, and he worked a lot on Platonism, on Plato, Aristotle, and Stoicism. And in the 80s, he has a book that has been translated in English as Philosophy as a Way of Life. In Chinese, there is also a translation. I think it was published in 2004. Zhu Xi. So the main idea of Hadot here, it's when he is reading and interpreting Greek text, it's to present this text of Greek philosophy as a spiritual exercise. So for him, there is no religious meaning here. When he uses this expression, spiritual exercise, it's not to refer or it's not connected with Ignatian spirituality. It's much more exercise of the spirit. So the spirit being one part of ourself, so one part of the soul. Especially in a Platonic or Stoiциan perspective, the spirit is the more the highest or the subtle part of the soul. And philosophy, in that perspective, it's conceived as an experience of transformation. There is a process, there is a number of exercises to perform to transform this part of the soul, make a partial self reach a universal self. So that's how Hadot is reading several Greek schools as this movement, to be able, maybe spontaneously in our lives, we have only our perspective on events and relationship or on ourselves. And for Hadot, spiritual exercises or exercises of the spirit in ancient Greek philosophy aim at making us have a broader and larger perspective on ourselves. And basically, for Hadot, you have 4 ways to achieve this movement from a personal self to a universal one. One is through an experience, so he calls it oceanic experience. A second one through philosophical discourse. 4, through spiritual exercises, and 4, through understanding a text. So when you try to text and put yourself in the process of engaging and confronting yourself with the objectivity of the text. So let us say a few more words about this 4 way of experiencing the transformation of the self. Regarding the first one, the oceanic experience, here is the way Hadot describes it. I think I am a philosopher since that time. If we mean philosophy, the fact to be conscious of the existence of being in the world, this experience has strongly influenced my conception of philosophy. I used to consider philosophy as a transformation of the perception of the world. So here, Hadot also uses a number of images, and we can think about surfing. So it's an experience of when you do surf, or when you watch at stars at night in the sky, you may feel yourself involved in something broader, in something larger, and you are one part of this universal perspective. And for Hadot, that's exactly what's going on in the oceanic experience. It's rather oceanic than cosmic, because when you say oceanic, or like the experience of surfing, you are involved in a movement. You find yourself contemplating and finding a balance in the middle of movement and being transformed in a way in that place. So this experience was the own experience of Hadot. That's also the way he describes ancient text, ancient Greek philosophy. So for example, if you think about the symposium, at the beginning of the symposium, when Socrates is not yet in the meeting, talking with other speakers, there is a description in the text of Socrates having this kind of oceanic experience of being moved from a personal perspective to a universal one, which is of course also the movement of philosophy. If we understand philosophy as an effort to universalize, to try to contemplate ideas or something, a logos, or well, then you are moving from the bottom of the cave to contemplating ideas outside the cave. So that's one aspect to this. That's one way to describe the oceanic experience. But then Hadot goes deeper in the description. So he would say that I would distinguish 3 levels more 1. 3 levels. So that's a description of the movement of moving from the partial self to a more universal self. I would distinguish 3 levels more 1. 3 levels. First, the sensitive conscience, where the ego behaves as if it would merge with the body. And then rational consciousness, where the self becomes aware of himself as a soul and as a discursive thinking. And finally, so that's the 3rd level, a spiritual consciousness in which the self discovers that ultimately it was always subconsciously spirit or intellect. It is at that level that Plotinus and his disciple Porphyry especially regard as a true self. Philosophy is to rise, and that's the most important part in that quote. Philosophy is to rise from the 1st level to the 3rd one. I said 3 level plus 1 because the mystical experience, the oceanic experience, represents a level all different. So here, I have 2 observations of that quote to explain Hadot's perspective. The first one is here you see that there is an anthropology. There is one way to understand what a human being is that is very specific, and the soul is divided in 3 levels. And philosophy or spiritual transformation is definitely a spiritualization, moving to the spirit, moving to the intellect, to this universal level, the 3rd one. And the second commentary, which is Hadot is here quoting Plotinus and Porphyry. Both of them are Neoplatonic philosophers, and we are very much in that perspective. In fact, when Hadot is elaborating his understanding of philosophy as a way of life and philosophy as a spiritual transformation, he is in a Neoplatonic understanding of philosophy, which is not unique, of course, and we could criticize that. In fact, that's one thing that we can discuss in the conversation at the end. It's does it work for other way of understanding philosophy? But in Hadot's perspective, when we speak about philosophical discourse, we speak about another way to transform, which is when we engage in dialogue, in debating. We are passing in, and Socratic dialogue are definitely on that side. It's about moving to the universal, leaving my partial perspective on an issue and trying to reach an ideas or an idea. It's a definition of something common. When we can define justice, when we can define virtue, then we reach a common understanding on something, and we are universalizing our way of thinking. So that's why Hadot is going to say, when Plato wrote his dialogues, when Aristotle teaches and publishes his lecture notes, and when Epicurus wrote his letters, or even in his treatise on nature, in all cases, the philosopher explains a doctrine, he's exposing a system, that's true, but at the same time, he's trying to make the reader pass through a transformation. So that's an old quote in the French 19th and 20th century philosophy from Victor Goldsmith. La philosophie vise à former plutôt qu'informer. As a reader, when you read Plato's dialogue or when you read Aristotle, you are expected to move from several partial perspectives, and little by little in the process of reading, you are going to universalize or to transform your intellect or your way to think about what's going on. So that's how Hadot conceives that, which means that for Hadot, the real difference in philosophy, it's not between metaphysics, logics, and ethics, but rather between this process, this activity, this ongoing activity of philosophizing, of trying to universalize ourselves, and the text, which is only what remains after the activity. Or to put it in another way, for Hadot, to do philosophy, it's like riding a bicycle at night. An experience is at the root of the work. It's you first, when you try to do bicycle, you first try to move and to find a balance in the movement. And then the light is going to start, and it's a way to reflect at what was going on a movement that was already at a process that was already triggered. So in some, philosophy is like riding a bicycle, and I should add at night as a reflective moment. In fact, this understanding of philosophy as a spiritual transformation, and here we always need to remember it's an understanding of ancient Greek philosophy. There are different ways of understanding philosophy in the Western tradition, and this is with Hadot, we are very much focused on Platonism, Neo-Platonism, and Stoicism. But then this understanding of ancient philosophy is going to spread out and to be welcome and criticized and maybe burdened by other people. And one of the people who is going to use Hadot's understanding of philosophy is Michel Foucault. So especially in that book, L'herméneutique du sujet, which was published several years after the death of Foucault, Foucault develops a reading of Stoic masters, which is very close to Hadot. And Michel Foucault is going to describe the exercise of reading a text, of reading a philosophical text, as a way to trigger a process of meditation, of universalizing of the self, of transforming the spirit. And in fact, in the way Foucault is describing the exercise, it's of course an exercise of the intellect, but it's almost a physical. The body is involved in the process. So with Hadot, we are very much in the Platonic and Neoplatonic framework. With Foucault, we move to a deeper understanding, integrating, embracing Stoic masters. There is another author in the US, Martha Nussbaum. Martha Nussbaum is also working very much with the Stoic and Epicurean, but she's also working with Aristotle. And in fact, there is also one reading of Aristotle where we can find this process of observing different perspectives on the same question or the same problem, and to try to reach something above one's own perspective in the process. So this understanding of philosophy as a spiritual transformation has been received in other spheres, in a broader academic community, starting in the 90s, but later on it also spread out in other places. And here I would mention three academic communities that welcome the way of thinking. First academic community, it's basically Western scholars who are working on Chinese philosophy and who are using Hadot expressions. Well, it's legitimate to speak about philosophy in China, because in the West, there is not only one way to understand philosophy. And in fact, in the West, starting in the there is always a tension between understanding philosophy as a spiritual transformation or as something that is transforming ourselves as a subject, the ideal of wisdom, the ideal of knowledge, of a systematic knowledge organized in concept and in a very in a structure, in a philosophical system. And in fact, in the history of the West, sometimes you have a split between the two visions, especially in philosophies that pay a lot of attention to logics and language, but include the past years. I mean, in the 80s, there is a critique of this perspective, especially when it's exclusive. So people, you have Western scholars investigating Chinese philosophy who say, well, it's legitimate to speak about philosophy in the first sense, in a sense of a movement trying to change ourselves, of self-cultivation. I will come back on that. You have a second trend of scholars who are using Hadot to contrast Chinese tradition. So, so here there is a mistake. So our colleague from Leuven, Karine Defort, she's using it to contrast the Taoist perspective. And the same with other scholars who are explaining that somehow Hadot's perspective is very intellectual. So there is a transformation, there is a spiritual transformation in Chinese philosophy too. But in Chinese philosophy, there is also a dimension involving the body. For example, if you think about rituals, how in Confucianism rituals help to involve the body in transformation. Well, you cannot find something strictly equivalent in the way Hadot reflect on spiritual transformation. But still, this trend of scholars, they still use Hadot expression to show how you have different way of understanding philosophy in the West. And the third way, and the third group of scholars who are using Pierre Hadot, they are translators. So whether Zhang Xian or Jiang Tantan, they are people who have been translating Hadot's book. They are Chinese scholars based in China, and their research is mainly focused on Western philosophy. They are not that, strictly speaking, they are not Chinese philosophy scholars. And of course, I mean, all this group, you can find, in fact, I think it was in 2007 or 2008, in the Harvard Yangqing Institute, you had a reading group around Tu Weiming, who was reading Pierre Hadot, this book, The Philosophy as a Way of Life. And several people from this, the list you have in front of you, come from this group. For example, Peng Guoxiang or Chen Yichen, all of them attended this reading group on Pierre Hadot's book. So can we use one question, and in fact, that's I don't want to affirm that today, and I think it's part of the conversation we can have afterwards. Can we use this perspective on philosophy to speak about Chinese philosophy and especially Confucianism? So here, in fact, I am the heir of an history. To speak about Chinese philosophy, about Chinese tradition as a philosophy is not something new. And here we can think about the Jesuit work of translation of Chinese classics. And the first one was, one important one was the Confuciusinarum Philosophus, published in Paris in 1687. Well, even in the title of the book, Confucius is described as a philosopher. And later on, in the Philosophia Sinica, that was published in Paris in 1711, that is the work of François Noël, and we are working on it with Thierry Ménard, Daniel Canaris, myself, and other people. We also have a description of Chinese tradition as a philosophy. And of course, you can say that there is a choice of presentation here. For example, there is a choice in the way Jesuits translated several terms in the Chinese classics. For example, when you translate Junzi as a philosopher, you are creating an equivalence that can be discussed nowadays. And at the same time, if you consider that philosophy is a process where you try to reckon yourself, when you try to move from a partial self to a universal self, when you try to let yourself be shaped by classics, well, somehow this may not be that far from being a junzi in the analect. And the same when you try to, so for example, in the Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, sometimes the Jesuits, they decide to translate learning, xue, by the term philosophizing. And in fact, so we can criticize that nowadays in the 21st century, because we have another, especially if we are influenced by some ways of doing philosophy. But somehow, if we see philosophy as a moral process or as a spiritual process, to say that the philosophizing is learning the classics, maybe there is some consistency here. So, I mean, I do not have a definitive answer, and we can talk about this in the conversation. So here, I just wanted to emphasize that in the analect and in early Confessionism, there is a movement moving from the to understanding of what does it mean to be educated, to be transformed, from the six arts to the six classics. And of course, in the analect or in the Mencius, you have several places where the six arts or the six classics can be understood, and basically this activity of learning, of xue, can be understood not only as accumulating knowledge or achieving some mastery in a skill, but also as a spiritual and moral process. For a typical example of that, it's the relationship with the classics. So if you look at that picture, you can observe that in that painting, this boy is reading a book and is basically projecting himself in the story of the book. And it's helping him to little by little be able to name his own emotions and to channel them and to build his own character through this process of channeling and describing emotions. And that's, I think there is something similar in the way Confucianism and focus learning and reading the classics. And we have it here in the Analect 17:9. The master said, "Little ones, why do not one of you learn the book of poetry?" The book of poetry can be a source of inspiration and a basis for evaluation. Evaluation of assessing yourself, of knowing where you are, where do you stand, what is your situation in that context. They can help you to come together with others, as well as to properly express complaint. So in fact, when you read poetry, when you read literature, you are given tools, symbolic tools, to name, analyze, and describe your own feelings. You are given resources to identify your own feelings. And once you can identify and speak about your own feelings, then you can work with them. You can channel them. You can, I would not say try to control them, but at least you can enter a process of transformation with them. In the home, they teach you about how to serve your father, and in public life, they teach you about how to serve your Lord. They also broadly acquaint you with the names of various birds, beasts, plants, and trees. So here in this quote from the Analect, we have the process of to train, to learn the classics is going to shape yourself, your inner self, and little by little make you able to stand up and to display your role in a social or in social situations. But what it has take behind, it's the book of poetry that's same here as a Hadot, is going to help you to orient your intention. And that's the difference between reading a book and watching at inert object. When you read a book, you are going to, your intention is going to engage the symbols in the book, and little by little, your intentionality is going to be transformed by the symbols contained in the book, which is different from looking, if I look at my pen or at something that is not moving, this process, I mean, I can't look at my phone my phone, not at the screen, but at my phone, I can describe it, but my intentionality is not exactly engaging the phone as it does when I am reading a text and little by little processing the symbols in the text. So here in Analect 2.2, you have this quote of how reading the book of poetry is going to help yourself to orient and guide your intention. So can we apply this? So that's my thesis, but of course you can, you are perfectly legitimate to disagree with this perspective. And then I move from this understanding of early Confucianism to Neo-Confucianism, and especially Zhu Xi and how Zhu Xi understood what does it mean to read the classic as a way, and I think it's a way to transform ourselves and to let ourselves be shaped by the content of the classics. So of course, in the Song dynasty, you have a number of elements that explain the crisis of classical learning and why Zhu Xi little by little shape another method of reading. For sure, for Zhu Xi to commit oneself to the Confucian way and to read classic text reading by the sages, the 4 books, it's one way to train ourselves. So to look for the pattern, the xue Li, which is the purpose of the reading of reading the classics, little by little, by trying to exhaust the principle, to reach principle, and to let our mind process and perform this exercise, we are going to be transformed little by little. This is why here I put a quote from the Ule, but in fact, there are many places where you can find this. The most important in self-cultivation, in the process of learning, it's to enter in an attitude. It's to dispose yourself to unify your intention and somehow to exhaust the principles. It's only a mean in that way. It's also, it's only one way to achieve this ultimate purpose, that is to enter an inner attitude. So to read the classics, it's or to exhaust a principle, pattern. It's one way to achieve unification of intention. It's to experience the content of the classics. And so this is a description of what does it mean. I insist of this intention purpose because Zhu Xi himself, when we read the classics, we are trying to adjust our own intentionality to the intention of the sages from the past. In fact, the classics were written by the sages of the past, and they are, and we cannot have a direct access to their intention. But we can put ourselves in this work, in this process of deciphering and analyzing the patterns in the text, and little by little, let our intention being transformed and join, or maybe to adjust to this former sages' intention. So the most important, it's this process of letting our intentionality being transformed by different means. So I think that in Zhu Xi, for Zhu Xi, reading classics, it's an important way to achieve that, but it's not the only one. Rituals, performing rituals, or to be in charge of government, or to experience poverty could be other ways of achieving this spiritual transformation. So here I just develop a little bit this. So that would be my conclusion. In fact, we have been moving through a different understanding of what philosophy is, and in the mind of Pierre, philosophy is this process of universalization of the mind, of transformation, of spiritual transformation, in the sense of I let my spirit being transformed by dialogue with the master, by reading a text, by examination, self-examination, by different types of meditation, meditation of death, meditation of the present. And then in my second part, I have been assessing how different group of scholars are using Hadot's understanding of philosophy as a transformation in contact or in connection with Chinese tradition, and how somehow that may be the only way to understand Chinese tradition, but it's one way to connect with it as a spiritual transformation. And then I've been developing how this can work when we read the Analect, or when we read Zhu Xi's understanding of learning of self-cultivation. And that's, I would like to finish mentioning that. Maybe, so there are different ways to achieve this spiritual transformation. And when I was mentioning Hadot, I was mentioning different types of experience. And that's how Hadot is describing this spiritual transformation. In the case of Zhu Xi, and in a broader case, and that would be my framework of analysis, of course, reading the classics is something important. To speak with a master, or to confront yourself with a master, it's also an important way to achieve it. But I think that to perform rituals, of course, I mean, in the Analect for Zhu Xi, that's something very important. And experience of poverty, experience of being, I mean, Confucius was living in exile for many years, and the same happened to Zhu Xi. Zhu Xi was out of the court for many years and died being exiled, basically, being banished from the court. And this experience of being banished was also a place where they could be transformed. So that's the way to summarize that is to say, to pass through this process of self-transformation, of self-cultivation, spiritual transformation, is to confront ourselves with something hard, something where we are going to be affected by the hard objectivity in front of us. So thank you very much for your attention, and you are very welcome to ask questions or to debate or to contest or to object what I was trying to expose. Thank you very much.